Hello, 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 everyone, and obviously welcome to Schema. This is our first live event since Config 2020, which is absolutely crazy. I am so excited to actually be here in front of everyone and just to interact with all of you as well. In addition to that, I just want to give a little highlight of who I am quickly before we jump into all of this. I'm one of our product managers, as they mentioned, for our design systems stream over here at Figma. So hopefully you're using a bunch of those design systems features, which is why you're hopefully here today. But a little bit of background with me. Before this, I was over at Atlassian, and I got the opportunity actually to talk at Config 2020. Unfortunately, I did not do my due diligence whatsoever. We usually have a speaker dinner whenever we do these type of things, and I sat down next to someone, was chatting with them, and after a while I was just like, oh yeah, what's your name? And they was like, oh, my name's Dylan. And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. And then later on, I was just like, so what do you do? And this was after, in the back of my mind, I was like, man, I really want to work for this company someday. Luckily, with that snafu, things were still entirely okay, and I've been here about a year and a half working on design systems from the Pacific Northwest with my partner and my dog, Avocado. But let's jump right into it. So at the previous Schema, show went through and talked to us about the history of designing for the web. And even back in 1997, we had some of the core concepts of design that are still true today. One of these concepts was the importance of freeform design, the ability to explore ideas creatively, and to go between this ideation, iteration, and prototyping process really, really quickly. This is often really important at the beginning of your design process. But at the same time, there's another form of design as well, and that is structured design. This structured design is especially important near the end of the process, when you want to make sure you're designing things in a way that's compliant with the brands and the expression of the products and the languages that you're using to design these products. At Figma, the balance between these two worlds has always really been paramount. This ability to allow designers to freely flow between freeform and structured design is really what makes Figma what it is. And oftentimes, during this design process, we really want to iterate between these two things. But we have to be careful, because there's a balance between these two. If we index too much into freeform design, we can lose sight of the language that our products are trying to convey, and we end up in this state of unorganized mess. But likewise, if we index too much into structured design, we lose that spark of creativity that's in all of us as designers. And so that's a little bit of background on what we talked about previously, but now I want to jump into the state of design systems today. Today, design systems are more powerful, more flexible, more sophisticated than they ever have been before. And that's thanks, obviously, to a lot of the work that all of us have been doing here. But with that increased power that's there comes increased maintenance cost as well. I'm seeing a lot of the nods in the audience with this, because when we're actually adding things in and building out tons of variants and themes and other things, it requires a lot more cost to keep that up and to make small changes as well. One of these things that's really hard, and I want to highlight three of them, is layout. Early on in the design systems process, we had a component that was represented one way. Take this card component, for instance. It's got a little header thing and two other elements inside of it. And this is great when you're just starting out. But designers will often come to our teams and ask, hey, I want more flexibility. I want to represent these things in different ways. I have different needs for this component. And so we go and build out different variations of it. And oftentimes we represent this with variants in Figma today. Quick little show of hand, who's using variants? Everyone, I'd love to see that. Variants are amazing when we're trying to represent these different forms of layout that's there. But oftentimes, one of the difficulties with it is that it has a huge maintenance cost, especially when we're designing across multiple parameters that's there. We have this concept that we internally at Figma call variant explosion, and I'm sure all of you have experienced that before. And so we introduced this concept of component properties. And one of the great things with Boolean properties is it allows us to add in optional elements into the mix. This Boolean property can mean that we can have a component that has an optional image inside of it. This is great for a lot of components, but one of the issues is that when we start representing things in really different layout structures that are there, we can't really use these optional elements to do this. This card, for example, has a horizontal and a vertical arrangement of it. And we, as design system managers, have to draw out each variation that's there. And so one solution that we're seeing to really address this type of architecture that's here is to break out the individual items inside of it from the layout structure that's there. And by pulling these things out as subcomponents and building them to a larger component structure that's there, it allows for infinite variation of these components. And oftentimes what we're seeing is that designers are using these components in ways that we would have never imagined if we had only built out some pre-made little components for them. If you're interested in diving more into this, I highly recommend a talk from Nathan Curtis, who's going to be doing a little highlight during our live stream next week. Check out designsystems.com to follow that, as well as a bunch of other highlights from the other schemas we've done in other offices. The next area of complexity that we're seeing is in theming. Early on, when you're building that design system, you often have one theme for each component that's there. And it's not really even a theme. It's really just that we're adding colors into the layers that are inside of this component. But with that as well, probably means you have a ticket somewhere with your users requesting dark mode. And so with that, the next thing we usually do here is we add in a dark mode that's present in this component itself. But this creates some issues, because now we have two components that we need to maintain, the light mode version and the dark mode version. If you want to change the padding, change the layout, change anything else about this component, what ends up happening is we have to go and design these and update these independently. And then when we have multiple brands that are present, the scaling issue becomes really apparent. We have to go through for each one of the modes that's there and change it, and each one of the products that's there and change that as well. And the maintenance cost of this becomes a huge tax on that design system. And so one way we're seeing to address this right now is this concept that Esther Tran, the creator of the Design Tokens plugin, she's calling it a headless design system approach. And this approach is tremendous for all the white labeling purposes that you need. What it really does is it says, hey, build out the structure of your component independently. Don't apply color to it. Don't apply dimensions to it. Just lay out that structure that's there. And then later, use an actual token schema to map to that and to change the visual appearance of this. This is tremendously powerful, and we hope it'll be more powerful soon as we are working on tokens finally. And one of the great things about this is that when we have these things in this format that's there, we can insert them into multiple layouts, multiple platforms, and multiple brands, and they update themselves automatically. The other great thing about this, though, is that it means that we have a single sourced update for the maintenance cost that's there. Before this, what we'd have to do is we have to update each individual component and brand and theme independently. But now with an approach like this, what we can do is we can update just that structure and have it roll out to all the brands, themes, etc. that we have. The third thing that I want to talk about where we're seeing an increase of complexity is process. Some of the most mature design systems that we see today are incorporating process directly into their system. This is an example of UI2, one of the libraries that we have internally here at Figma, which is, by the way, really weird designing Figma in Figma. It gets really meta. But one important thing that we have inside of here is a little message that talks about how do I contribute to this file. And this simple piece of process that's there is tremendously important, especially for these large enterprise teams that are out there where you have multiple products, multiple brands, etc. Because if you don't have this documented process that's there, then what ends up happening is these subproducts and brands end up building splinter design systems because they don't know how to contribute back to the main one. And this process that's there really doesn't matter when you're dealing with a really small team. Like if you just got 4 people, you can be like, hey, Bob, I want to update this thing. And Bob's like, yeah, okay, cool, I'm doing all this stuff. You know exactly what I'm working on. But the problem is that as teams grow, this becomes more of an issue. At a slightly larger scale, you may not know that someone else, like Alice, is working on this thing that Bob is also working on. And so you end up stepping on each other's toes, and there's changes that are unexpected in your design system. process becomes more important. Doubly so when we're at a larger enterprise scale. Quick show of hands here, who has teams that are in multiple countries right now? Do you know what those teams are doing at any given moment? It's almost terrifying when you're working on these design systems, especially knowing the scale of what they reach as well. And so for teams like this is tremendously important. And so just like what we were seeing for layout complexity, increasing the maintenance cost, and just like what we were seeing with theming complexity, increasing the maintenance cost, this organizational complexity also increases the maintenance cost of our design systems. And we have to address that as well. But luckily, we can learn a few things from people on the other side of the pond. And there's a few things that we can learn from engineering that we can really adopt into our design processes as a whole. One of these is this concept of test-driven development, or hopefully what I would like to call test-driven design. We can build in tests into our systems today. And I highly recommend you add things like regression tests into your libraries today. We can do this by even just taking a few components, adding some overrides to them, and seeing whether or not those overrides transfer when we update our main components. This allows you to catch those issues early before you push it out to your teams that's there. Another thing that we see that's really important from a process standpoint that we're learning from the code side is something like branching and merging as a process that's there. I highly recommend this for any sort of design systems team. Get them to build a branch of your design system and merge that in. Let's step back for a second and look at the big picture that's here. I've been talking about a lot of complexity that we've been seeing. And this complexity comes in many different ways. There's that theming complexity, that layout complexity, that organizational complexity. And if we actually take a step back and look at how we're addressing each of those things that's there, well, we actually have quite a bit of overlap with code when we talk about design systems. Let's look at the things that we were talking about as solutions for each of these problems real quick. Subcomponents, an ability to separate out the individual pieces from the layout that's there. Slotted components have been a thing in code for ages. And if we look at things like headless design systems, this separation of structure from the actual presentation of it, HTML and CSS. And things like branching and merging and test-driven development, these are clearly code concepts that are there. And one of the things I really want to impart on you today is that the complexity of design is increasing. Design today may be over here, but we are increasing in complexity as we add in that power and flexibility into our design systems. And it's approaching the complexity of code. And so with that, we can really learn a lot of these things from code and incorporate those processes, and they're helpful. However, there's a little caveat that I want to warn you about that's here. If we bind and really structure design and put it into a box, we're going to lose that spark of creativity that's in all of us as designers. Because really, the flexibility of design is what makes it design. And so we really have to be careful with these things as we're adopting these processes from our engineering cohorts. Because there's things that are unique to design that we should really embrace. Things like creativity and exploration. Things like access around who can participate. At Figma, we always try to make it so that everyone can participate in design. But on the other side, there's definitely things that we should align towards dev on. Things like branching and merging, things like test-driven development are all things that can really help our design systems. And another way to think about this is early on in this design systems journey, one of the things I heard all the time from design systems teams was that the purpose of a design system was to reduce the chance of making a mistake. I think that's the wrong framing for design systems. Because really, that's coming from a very, dictatorial kind of way of approaching design systems, where you're imposing rules on designers because you're scared of what they can do with it. You're treating them like children almost. And that really shouldn't be what design systems are for. Design systems should be there so we can reduce the friction that's present in design so we can increase that creativity of our designers. And I'd love if you walked away from this thinking about the framing of design systems like that. And so with that, welcome to Schema. I hope you go ahead and actually absorb a ton of the stuff from the talks that we have today. But more importantly, discuss amongst yourselves. Share those ideas out. Talk about ways that we can increase that creativity and accelerate that efficiency of design. And especially, give us feedback too. Especially us at Figma, we're building things out to support all of you, and so we want to hear from the community as well. There's going to be a live actual Q&A session for our live event, which will be next week. Ask questions. Put suggestions on the forum as well, because we read those all the time. And so I'd like to give a little highlight to all the speakers that we have here at Schema. You'll be able to see not only a bunch of them today, but also all of the talks that we have throughout all the events we've done with Schema on our YouTube channel and at designsystems.com. We have an amazing schedule that's here, and we hope you really pay attention to all these talks. Take notes, learn, ideate, and advance those design systems. So with that, thank you so much, and welcome to Schema, everyone.